to Porous Borders. This is episode 14. Today on the show, I'm speaking to Yudhistira Agato, vocalist and guitarist for the band Vague, guitarist for the band Jirapah, music journalist and translator for Vice Indonesia, and one of my oldest friends. I first met Yudhis back in 2007 at a Converge show in Brisbane when he was in Australia studying, and we used to hang out at shows all the time in Brisbane in the late 2000s. In 2010, he moved back to Jakarta, where he started to get involved in the underground music scene, playing in bands and organizing shows. And in 2016, Yudhis started working as a translator and a writer for Vice Indonesia when they opened their Jakarta office. Since then, he's written a lot about experimental and underground music in Indonesia, and he's interviewed My Disco, Rich Brian, Kamasi Washington, Khruangbin, and many others. You can find links to Yudhis's writing in the show notes. Not all of it is translated into English, but a good chunk of it is. Yudhis's main project is called Vague, and it's a Revolution Summer-inspired post-hardcore band. He plays guitar and sings in that project, and they're quite active in the Jakarta underground scene. They play shows pretty regularly, and in the last few years they've been releasing a lot of splits with other underground bands from Southeast Asia. Their newest release is a split with the band Wreck, which is out on Hamer Records as a digital release and a 7-inch, and they also have splits out with Killer Calculator from Kuala Lumpur and The Kuda from Bogor. All of them are amazing bands and well worth your time. Besides those splits, Vague has one full length called Footsteps, which you can find on all of the streaming platforms. Yudhis also plays guitar in the band Jirapah, which is a Jakarta-based project that has played in all kinds of different formats. They've done droney ambient stuff, psychedelic music, and more recently, more pop-based music. Their most recent release is an LP called Planetarium, and it's available as a pay what you want download from Bandcamp, and it's on all of the streaming services as well. This interview covers quite a lot of ground. We start by talking about Yudhis's projects and then move into talking about the differences between Vice Indonesia and Vice in Western countries like Australia or the United States. The politics around choosing what language to use when writing lyrics, and the unique relationship Indonesia's underground scene has with corporate sponsorship. Towards the end of the interview, we just kind of catch up a bit on what's going on in Jakarta's underground scene as well, and Yudhis talks a bit about the kinds of things we might see in the future, which is quite interesting. Quick reminder, please share, rate, review, and subscribe to the show. Please check out the Sonic Vortex compilation and the Panchawala split, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel. I just put up a crazy video of a set by Sitback and PGR from last month's Jogja Noise Bombing Festival. It's really one of the wildest crowds I've ever caught on film, so it's definitely worth watching. And that's all from me for this week. Here's my conversation with Yudhis.
I started playing guitar when I was 11 or 12 something, and it was like most of the kids, you just saw a bunch of rock bands on MTV, and Green Day, for me, you wanted to play electric guitar. That's kind of how it was for me. And then I play in like a band in middle school, just we performed like once at a school event, and then nothing really came out of it. High school, and then university, I went to Brisbane. That sort of, I think it again sort of restored my love for music, because there were so many bands touring, bands that I would have never gotten the chance to see in Jakarta. So music was a big thing when I was in university. I went to so many shows, bought vinyl, CDs, cassettes and stuff like that. And then when I came back to Jakarta, I started working like an office job. Was not really into it, and that's when I sort of started playing music, because I needed something other than just the work, because it was driving me nuts. And so basically all these bands, all those influences that I had accumulated over the years, just now I started to try to express it on guitar. And it was hard.
Yeah.
It was hard because I wasn't really a good guitarist to begin with. So, and then it just years of finding out the tone that you want, sort of the style of playing, figure out the effects and the amps and the people you play with. And I think that's when I was 23, hence the Vague song 23. And then I think it was short, just months after Vague, and then I met Ken. He had just come back from New York. He performed by himself as Jirapah, and I was like, oh, this is really cool. He was playing with like loop pedals and stuff. So I talked to him afterwards, and he was into hardcore, he was into punk, so we just hit it off. And then a week later he was like, hey, do you want to play guitar for Jirapah? And I said yes. So since then I've been playing in Vague and Jirapah.
And so you spent 3.5 years in Brisbane.
Yeah, that's right.
Can you talk a bit about what was your time like there? Like what I know you went to a lot of shows, but maybe like I'm sort of curious why you chose Brisbane actually, because if you go to Melbourne's
That's
full
right,
of Indonesian people, but it's not so common in Brisbane.
I was actually supposed to go to Melbourne because I did a diploma for MIBT, which stands obviously for Melbourne International Business MIBT
Institute,
Technology or Institute, whatever.
Yeah.
So the logical thing would have to go to Melbourne, but for some reason I had this weird idea that I thought it would be fun to go to like a smaller, less well-known city and see what it was like. So I was like, after I graduated from the diploma, I went to the sort of the headmaster, if you will. I went, can I go to Brisbane instead? And he was like, why? He asked the same question.
Right.
He had the same face, but then he was like, all right, if that's what you want. So that what happened. I went to Brisbane, and then it wasn't until I went to Melbourne that I was like, this is why everybody goes to Melbourne. But Brisbane was fun when I was there, because I think the type of music that I like was sort of blooming when I was there. This was in like 2006 up until like 2009. There's a lot of punk bands, a lot of emo bands, and there's a lot of really good local bands. I really enjoy my time there.
Yeah, what do you remember about the scene there from that time?
I just remember, there were a lot of, there's a lot of sort of mid-level bar shows in the valley, but there's a lot of really cool house shows here and there, whether it's in West End or I can't remember that place with all the TVs.
The hangar.
Correct.
Yeah.
And then Ahimsa House.
Yeah.
Right? There's a lot of DIY shows. I remember the No Culture Fest.
Yeah.
There were a lot of sort of jazzy emo bands and quirky indie stuff. And so it was really fun. I went to a lot of punk shows as well.
Yeah, I think that house show culture is kind of it sort of comes and goes in Brisbane, but it's always been part of the music culture there.
Yeah.
It's a nice thing. What was I going to ask you next? So the first project you started when you moved here was Vague. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. How did that band start?
I mean, it was so funny story. I met Jen online
Right.
through Last FM.
Okay.
Similar taste, whatever. And so, we met up, and then I was keen on sort of that revolution summer sort of sound, and he was keen as well. So it's like, okay, let's do something. So initially it was just two of us jamming, and we hadn't found our style yet at the time. But then as I started to write songs, it's like, oh, this is not bad. Maybe we should find a bass player. Then we met Adit, who also plays for Obsessive Compulsive, the grindcore band. Now he's in another band called Morja, which is sort of like a prog grind sort of stuff.
Right.
But yeah, so initially Vague was three of us, and we started jamming, and then the demo came out, then the EP came out, and I think it was pretty exciting because it wasn't just that three of us were trying to sort of find our style, but also like in the scene there were no other band like us per se. There were a lot of hardcore bands. There were a lot of sort of trashy bands and like post-rock bands, shoegaze bands, but like there's nothing in between. There's this weird space, and from what I learned from Brisbane is that most of the bands that I love fall within this sort of weird place between the two. So that's what we're trying to do. And unfortunately I did had to leave because of commitment to work and family. And we found Gary.
Yeah.
And then that sort of also changed the sound again because he was more into punk,
Right.
melodic stuff. So yeah, and then we've been at it for like 8 years now.
You must have seen the scene in Jakarta change a lot in that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess like, were you involved in it at all before you came to Brisbane?
I mean,
besides like high school bands, but were
Right.
you going to local shows
Well,
and stuff?
I went to like a few shows, but most of them were like bigger independent bands at the time. Like I went to the launching party of Seringai's first EP.
Right.
I went to see Coil, but those were like sort of big, even back then, back in the independent scene. So in that sense, I'm not sure if I could say that I was involved. I wouldn't say I was involved. I was just, I was just a kid trying to sort of find interesting things and just end up on those shows. But I didn't know anything about the scene back then.
So what was it like trying to get your first shows when you started the band and came back here? Did you know people or were you?
Yeah, so I was lucky that John sort of knew people because he had been like he already was in a band called Raincoat, sort of
Right.
a youth crew hardcore band. So he was
That's the one he sang in.
correct. Yeah. So he already knew some people in the hardcore scene, but that was pretty much it. And then I remember. Back then, someone contacted me. I think there was a band from Melbourne, Circuits.
Oh, Circuits.
And
Yeah.
Daihila,
Yeah.
which I love, from Malaysia. They wanted to tour Indonesia, but then they said, "Oh, nobody wants to organize a show for them in Jakarta because this style of hardcore, quote unquote, is not popular, right?" Back then, Jakarta is all about like thrash and like skate punk, that sort of style. Nobody wanted to do like emo, post-hardcore, whatever. And so I thought, oh, this would be a shame because I really wanted to see them and I wanted people to see them. But I didn't know anybody at the time, So, even to do a show at like Rosie was unthinkable because I didn't know anybody. I didn't want to lose money.
Yeah.
I had no money at the time. I was still working accounting job.
Yeah.
I was making like $300 a month or something. I didn't have any money.
Yeah.
And so, but I really wanted to do this. So then, fortunately, with some help, we got a show in Bekasi. It's a studio show at I think it was called Dromotora. And that happened to be Vake's first show.
Right.
We were awful. Like, by the way, I'll just say it out loud. We were awful because it was our first show. I was so nervous, I remember like after 3 songs in, the overdrive wasn't on. and I didn't
Right.
even realize it. It was so horrible. Like I didn't know anything, and because also I was so worried about the show that I didn't think of our performance. But anyway, doesn't matter. The show went on. It went really well, and that's the extra show.
And from there, you guys became pretty active pretty quickly in the scene here, right?
Yeah, I mean, active in a sense that you play more than 2 shows a year.
Sure,
I guess.
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like we weren't like playing 30 shows a year or anything like that. But I think after the EP came out, it's sort of people sort of started to know about us, and then we put out the album Footsteps, 2014, and so I guess in a way that sort of put us on the map per se. And yeah, we've been playing on and off since.
And how did you get involved with Jirapah? You said before you met Ken.
Yeah.
When you saw him play.
So so Jirapah is a bit funny because Jirapah is essentially just Ken.
Right.
Like, he's amazing. He can sing, he can write songs, he can play guitar really well, and he can even mix his own stuff. And so basically, Jirapah was okay. So it was Ken, and then back then my first show with Jirapah was just Ken and me. So it was just 2 of us. And at that point, we even played like a noise show together as a duo at the time. I think it was Studio Rama's Mind Zap, if I remember. Adit has the footage. You can ask
Okay.
him. And then slowly it became like a band, but it was still, no doubt, it was still Ken's band. And it wasn't until this upcoming album that is not out yet that everybody is sort of a bit more involved in terms of like songwriting and like structure of the song. But until at that point, basically almost every song that Jirapah has released has been written and performed and recorded by Ken himself.
Right. So you guys are like, I guess you'd say you're part of the indie scene in
Yeah.
Jakarta, but
Yeah.
there's a lot going on in your sound. There's and you've kind of done different releases that focus on different aspects of the sound.
Yeah.
So there's some more like psychedelic and more krautrock influenced stuff, and some that's more poppy and
Yep.
yeah.
So the Ken, the singer and the other guitar player, he really likes Japanese psychedelic stuff. So his favorite bands are like Yura Teikoku and like. So he likes stuff like that, and I think you can see it in the weirder, wackier texture of Jirapah. That's when those sort of influences come out. You might not hear it if you just listen to like the pop songs that he wrote, but yeah, those influences are there. And then there was a period where he was really into Afrobeat, and that's when the song Soul came about, which has sort of African style beat. So he listens to a lot of stuff. He likes jazz. He likes Deer Hunter. And funny enough, he doesn't even listen to Interpol, a band that we got compared to a lot when we first we were starting out here, because this guy is from New York and he sings in like a lower tone. And it has that sort of darker sort of indie sound. But funnily enough, he doesn't even listen to Interpol. There you go. So he hates it every time. He's like, "Oh, this sounds like Interpol." It's like, "What?" He hates it.
What would you say was like I guess in Brisbane you weren't super involved in like the organizing side of music, but you went to a lot of shows and you met a lot of people there. What would you say was like the biggest differences you noticed coming back here and getting involved in the scene here?
For me, the first thing that struck me was, and maybe this is out of necessity because Brisbane was relatively small, had a relatively small scene, so it's very common to see a show with like a mixed bill, like multiple genres, and that was actually one thing that I really enjoy in Brisbane. because it was so small, you would have an emo band, a noise band, a punk band, a synth pop band in one bill, and you can just sort of check them out if you like them. But when I got back to Jakarta, I started going to shows, and it would be like a hardcore show would be 16 bands, all with like similar guitar tone, all influenced by New York hardcore. Or you could go to a post-rock show. It would be 4 bands trying to be Explosions in the Sky, 3 bands trying to be Sigur Rós.
Yeah.
And I was just like, whoa, this is different, you know, and I wasn't used to it. And I did it, you know, it was, and I could understand the reason behind the 16 bands was because they all had to chip in to rent the venue. And so obviously the more bands you have, the cheaper it gets, right? You know, it's a struggle that I think most independent bands go through. But yeah, I noticed that. So that to me was the most striking difference. And then obviously there's different cultural thing, like in Brisbane everybody sort of brings their own like gear and equipment, right? Even like the most punk band, right? The one that looks, you know, like they live on the streets or something. They have a car, they would bring their own like Marshall hat and cabinet. But here, most people don't have money to, you know, to afford those equipment, and because a lot of bands also like play for like only like 15 minutes, 20 minutes, it doesn't really make sense to sort of set up your own equipment when it's like a 16 band bill. You know, so it's you know, the culture here was usually a venue would have their own like equipment, or you need to hire, right? But also what it means is sometimes often you're left with equipment that you don't really know how to use, right? Or that it doesn't really match the tone you're looking for, but that's sort of how it was.
Yeah, it's a like at least as a guitarist, it's like a good kind of like a challenge, I guess, to get used to something.
It is a challenge,
but it's like in a good way, I think. Sometimes.
You know, so then you kind of know what tone you're looking for. You know, after having to play a lot of amps whose brand you've never even heard of, you know, when you finally find a good amp, you sort of know, oh, okay, so this is what I'm supposed to sound like, you know?
I'm curious, after like 8 years being part of the scene here, how have you noticed it change? It's kind of come a long way, right? And,
I would say so. I mean, to me, like, I think internet has been the biggest difference, like maybe like it is in every other country. I think now the scene is a lot more decentralized, and what it means is there's a lot of small collectives from different areas of Jakarta or even around Jakarta that sort of have their own little scene. Because back then, and when I say back then, this was even like before me, when I was in high school, you know, you would have Aksara Records, and they were like the biggest thing in Indonesian independent scene. So everything was sort of centralized around that label and anything that they put out, right? But after the demise of Aksara Records, things just went in their own different ways, and I think it's also because of the internet. People can listen to like a band from like Iceland and be inspired, and play music like that. And so that's, I think, also what created all these different scenes. You know, you started having all this more, you know, quote-unquote obscure genres, you know, post-rock, noise, experimental, and all this. And so I think it, you know, it was a good maybe 4, 5, 6 years of adjustment until we have what we have now. And now I feel like in terms of diversity of the music and whatnot, it's actually a lot healthier. I feel like the scene is a lot healthier because there's really not a lot of like, because okay, back then you have all these gatekeepers, right? You had to go through them if you wanted to play shows, if you wanted to be recognized. There are all these people who organize shows or work for a media. So if you're not noticed by them, you can't really get through. But now, because everyone sort of does their own thing, there's a lot of ways for you to be recognized or to find sort of your own listeners, which I think is a good thing.
So, like in Jakarta, it's very expensive still to hire a venue to put on a show, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So that's one of the
Hurdle.
challenges,
Yeah.
right? And I guess something like people who aren't familiar with the scene here might not know is that a lot of like it was only from about like the mid 90s, right, that you guys here started getting access to all these different kinds of music from overseas. Like it was a lot more closed off.
Yeah, so
that,
I
right?
think maybe any kind of quote unquote subculture maybe started in like late 80s, early 90s. That's when we started to have like heavy metal bands. I think
Right.
metal came first.
Right.
And then sort of punk and hardcore in like early mid 90s. But yeah, you were right. It was at the time the way that it happened, the transfer of knowledge, is that there were a bunch of kids who went to school abroad, and they would buy tapes of bands overseas, and they would bring them here, and then it would get copied like crazy.
Right. Yeah.
And that's sort of how the transfer of knowledge worked, because back then, obviously, internet wasn't around. Friendster didn't exist yet, and not many had the money to like do mail order from overseas. So that's the only way you would find out about all these bands.
Yeah. So you have been working for Vice Indonesia
Yeah.
since it opened about 3 years
3
ago,
years, yeah.
right? Can you talk a little bit about how, I guess like people from Australia or US might have a particular perception of Vice and kind of the space it occupies in the media landscape in those countries. But I think here it's a little different. It's got a bit of a different vision or different things you guys are covering, right?
I think the only difference is because Vice Indonesia is still so small. It was small and it is still small. So basically, the company's identity is still made of the people that work for them. And when we started out, there's a lot of people who genuinely came from subcultures. Right? We had a translator, my friend Manan, who used to write primitive zine, and he went to shows a lot. We had another translator, Afi, who's very involved with like women's issues and LGBT, and she also runs the bookstore Post
Okay.
in Santa.
Okay, yeah. I've been there.
So there were a lot of people who actually came from like community, and that's why I feel like a lot of the content were pretty spot on. Yeah, because we all came from those communities and we live it.
Yeah.
And so maybe, and who knows, if Vice Indonesia gets really big one day, maybe we'll turn into assholes as well. Who knows? But for now, like, there's still enough space that you can write or cover to a certain extent things that you like or things that you think are genuine and exciting in the scene. So,
Yeah, so you've been, you're a translator for them, but a writer also.
yeah, sometimes.
And primarily around music, right? The writing you've
That's
done.
the only thing I know
Yeah.
about.
Well, what's some of the stuff you've covered as a music writer for them?
I mean, there's a lot of the more basic stuff of just like, this band just released this album and blah, 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 the sort of more common. But there were also pretty interesting, usually if there's a touring band, for some reason, I would always get the duty of like interviewing them. So I interviewed Kamasi Washington. That one was amazing. Khruangbin and bands like that. But there were also like, I can't remember his name, but I interviewed a guitar player from Sumatra who played like traditional style.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. And he had, he lived such a different life that the article just came out. I thought was really good, and it got picked up by Noisy as well, because I think it was so different, right? This guy basically essentially says he hates modern music
Right.
because he wants to keep sort of his music pure. So that one's interesting. I've covered a bit on a few articles on like noise and experimental scene, mostly I think centralized on Jakarta because that's where most of the noise experimental sort of projects come from. Like Nusa Sonic, I covered that festival. The festival was really good. So yeah, music-wise, I can still pretty much write about what I want to, as long as it's interesting, it's on brand, and the editor gives me the green light.
Yeah. What was your impression of Nusa Sonic Festival? You were there for a few days of the festival.
Unfortunately, I was
year,
not
right?
there for the entire. I didn't get to see any of the performances.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was there for like the first 2 days or so, and I get to interview quite a lot of people. I thought it was really good. It was really interesting. Also, how they did it. I thought it was really organic. The fact that they get a few days to like do workshops, to rehearse, and so I feel like they had enough time to get to know each other, also to learn each other's sort of cultures. So yeah, kudos to Mr. Sonic. I thought it was one of the more interesting music festivals I've been to. I know it's probably not for a casual listener. If you're a casual listener, you probably don't really care about the practice, the workshops. You just want to see the show, and that's fine too, because I'm sure the shows were amazing. But as someone also who plays music, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Nusa Sonic was, essentially like maybe 10 years in works. It's the accumulation of what Jogja has been doing, and Jogja has been doing it for a long time. Especially if you take a look at Yes No Wave, the net label that Walk created. It gave a lot platforms to a lot of Jogja bands, weirder bands, noise bands, experimental. They even had like White Shoes on there. So yeah, Jogja has been doing it for a while, and it's always been that thing. I feel like I think Walk also like explained this to me at Nusa Sonic. It's because Jogja has always been like an art city, and there's a lot of cultural exchange here, a lot of people coming and go, and so Jogja is very open to like ideas, and also because I feel like in terms of music industry, there's not a lot there, and what it means is, bands in Jogja have a more sort of fuck it attitude, and they just go for whatever they want, because they don't really think about whether the music is going to be marketable or not, because they don't think about those stuff. That's like Jakarta, Bandung territory, basically.
Yeah. So Vague has had quite a lot of split releases out at this point, right?
Yeah.
So
We're
you've
lazy.
done one with Killer Calculator,
That's right, yeah.
with
Kuda.
the Kuda. That's right. Who else? What else have you?
And we put out one 7-inch single.
Yep.
And then there's more splits
Yeah.
coming soon.
Quite a few in the
Yeah.
works. How did you guys get connected with the Killer Calculator
Oh,
guys?
okay. So the story with Killer is, I had heard about them for a while. Even when I was in Australia, I had heard about them, right? And I was so psyched that there's a band like that coming from Southeast Asia, because back then I didn't know any band like that from Indonesia. But then I didn't know them personally and whatnot. But then I think it was in 2013 that The Weeknd from Malaysia, they came to Indonesia and they wanted to shoot live performances of like 10 bands, and one of them being Jirapah. Now, one of the person working for The Weeknd was Ali Joe, drummer of Killer. So we got acquainted that way. And when Killer came to Jakarta in 2014 or something, I organized the show for them, and we played together in I think Jakarta and Bandung, and they were like, "Yo, we should do a split." I'm like, "Hell yeah!" So that's how it happened.
Yeah. I sort of feel like there's this small group of bands that includes you guys and them, and maybe like Tarkam, and maybe Rec, and the Kuda, maybe that's kind of doing this sort of, I don't know what to call it, weird punk or something. Like this kind of like music that's rooted in punk, but it seems to be going more and more towards a sound that's like very Southeast Asian in its character. Would you agree with that, or?
I mean, I don't know about the Southeast Asian part. Maybe it's the Indonesian lyrics that make it sound that way. But I would say, like, from all those names that you mentioned, it's just it's like taking influences from like sort of different style era of punk rock and then mix it with something else that you also like, and that's about it. Because I think, like I said, it's like the bands that I like are usually the ones that sort of play like between genres, and so that's also another reason why I sort of feel connected more to these bands, because I feel like they're doing something similar, not exactly the same, but something similar.
Yeah.
And I personally, I really like it, and I hope there will be more bands like this in the future.
Yeah, I feel like it's a kind of, I don't know if you could call it a scene or like its own scene or anything like that, but it's sort of like a, I don't know, just like a branch of punk that's like sort of developing, and maybe it's like, I said it's like has a Southeast Asian sound before, but maybe it's just more like a, like, it's this kind of weird take on punk that's unique to this part of the world. Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe because also I don't know, in Australia are there a lot of bands playing this style? I have no idea.
I don't know. Maybe years ago, a bit more, and when that kind of Yellow Ghost screamo scene was around a bit more. Yeah. But there also are bands, like Agency from Canberra,
that's right,
and there's a few others around the place. My band, Turnpike, I guess, would be like
right. They're still around.
Quite a post-hardcore band, but has a really Australian vibe to it too.
Whenever To the North quite steps decide to play.
Yeah. But like the longer I'm away from it, the less I feel like I know about what's going on there.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things where I feel like maybe Australia and Southeast Asia is kind of similar in that it's more of a recent thing, that the scene's kind of grown up a bit and tried to find its own sound rather than trying to mimic the sound of US bands or UK bands.
I think that identity part, it's still something that Indonesians or maybe Southeast Asians still struggle with a lot, right? Because what is Indonesian music? What is Indonesian sound? That has always been a debate. Even the scene went through phase where indie bands purposely would sing in English, because before that every Indonesian band that sings in Indonesian was like considered sort of the lame Malay rock band,
right.
That would always sing songs about love and relationship. And so that wave of indie bands, I think it was early 2000, they would all sing in English to sort of differentiate themselves. And then funny enough, everything comes in cycles, and then after that then more bands started to sing Indonesian again, to be like, well, we don't want to sound like an American, like a copycat of American bands. So these things come in cycles, and I think now we're in a spot where everybody can sort of chooses what language they're more comfortable in, but there's definitely, I think, more effort from bands to like sing in Indonesian. And that's something that we're trying to do as well. Jirapah had just released an album full Indonesian. We are putting out a split soon with Reg, 2 songs, all Indonesian. Split with Barefoot was gonna be all Indonesian. With your band, I might slip in one English song or something, just because I know, it's gonna get released probably in Australia as well. But yeah, and I think we should do it that way.
Yeah.
There's really no need to like. I don't want to say cater, right? But back then, definitely a lot of bands I think they sing in English with hope of getting picked up by international audience or like foreign label or something.
Yeah.
But now, if you see what Senyawa is doing and how White Shoes get recognized, it wasn't because they were singing in English. If anything, like you find your own sound and you just do it. And like if people from overseas don't get it, that's their problem, not ours.
I remember talking to White Shoes a little bit about this a couple of years ago too, and them saying, if I remember correctly, hopefully I'm not misquoting, but I remember them saying they kind of made a conscious decision on their second album to use Indonesian for all of the lyrics, and I don't know, like maybe it's just an exoticism thing as a Western listener.
There's definitely a bit of that. Yeah.
Yeah, for me it's much more interesting to hear that than
because it changes everything. Like different intonation, right? Different pronunciation. So it changes everything, even the way you sing.
Yeah.
Because Indonesian language has more syllables. So it also changes the way you sing.
Yeah, and you have some very like those really strong rolled R.
Yes,
kinda,
there's a lot of R's.
Yeah, and the
Yeah, and I'm not gonna lie, it was also a challenge for me to start writing lyrics and sing in Indonesian at first, because I sort of grew with the music, like being in Australia, and after that I was working as an English teacher, so there's a lot of English in my life that I had to sort of learn how to sing in Indonesian. It's different, and it changes the band sound. I agree. So I feel like it's something that everybody should try to do, because I'm not gonna mention names, but there's a lot of local bands here that obviously owe their influences to like Western bands and whatever. That's fine, because we do it too. But then they would also sing it in English, and sometimes the English is not always the best. So I feel like the message gets lost in translation. So I always feel like, why don't you pick a language that you're most comfortable in? Get the language across, and it would probably sound way more interesting that way, because nobody has done it before.
Yeah. I think a lot about a band like the Kuda, where the just the kind of the way it's so Indonesian. So
even the way they curse, mid songs and stuff, they can just say like,
and just the cadence of the like.
And you can tell that they're super comfortable. Because that's like the language they use every day.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think the band PK14 really early on was really interesting for me. They're from China, the way that the singer would kind of fit these kind of like half shouted, half spoken passages in Chinese, and there was no like. It didn't sound like he was trying at all to be like any singer I recognized, even though the band kind of had a pretty recognizable post-punk kind of sound. The vocals were really kind of like they don't I don't know, kind of like fit into the bars the same way that like any of those like UK 70s 80s post-punk bands.
It's like the past few years you've seen this resurgence of like a lot of like Latino punk bands, right? And a lot of them are like even bands that are not from like South America, right? There are bands from like Australia, America. They were singing in like
or
in
Jogja.
like Spanish. Or Jogja, that's right. Hey, Manus.
Yeah.
They were singing in like Spanish, right? They might have like members of Latino descent or Spanish descent. And what I'm trying to say is that had they sung in English, it would just sound like any other hardcore band. You know what I mean? It would lose some of its identity and uniqueness. So
Yeah. So talking about that, what's going on in Jakarta scene right now that you think is interesting or exciting?
I think what's exciting right now, I think more so than the bands, is the struggle between like small young collectives that are trying to put on shows for like local bands and smaller touring bands against bigger shows mostly sponsored by like cigarette companies. It's a very interesting dynamics there. And so yeah, I think this is really interesting because right now it feels like those two things are closer than ever. Back then, they were like worlds apart.
Right.
But now there's a lot of overlaps. There's a lot of cigarette companies because they're not allowed to advertise anymore, right? What they do is they're very snaky, they're very clever. They know there's a lot of market within the sort of independent scene. So what a lot of these cigarette companies do is they have like a sub company, smaller one. It could be like a media,
Right.
or like organizer, and obviously they would change the name, and so if you don't do any sort of research, you don't even know that these companies are affiliated with cigarette companies, and they would write about indie bands, and they would put on shows, they would host like talk shows, workshops, so it looks like they're part of the scene.
Yeah.
So it's very tricky.
Yeah, that's
It's very
the
tricky.
Red Bull Music Academy model. Yeah.
It's very tricky, and and there's also a lot of people within the independent scene who they want some money. There's nothing wrong with that. So they essentially open the gate for these companies to sort of crawl in, and it's a very tricky issue. But yeah, that's sort of where we are. I feel
Do you
like.
think bands are becoming more accepting of that, or do you think it's still a bit of a
I feel like there's.
divide?
It depends. I feel like there's a lot of bands, quote unquote indie bands, that have always wanted to become big, have always wanted to make more money. So these bands would not be opposed to it. They probably don't care as much. But there's also bands that maybe are more rooted in the DIY sort of punk background that they care more about this stuff, and they want to make sure that they're not just being exploited or play into the hands of these companies. Because I think the most important thing is you don't want to rely on these companies to like organize shows for you, because these companies, they have a lot of money. Obviously they can put on shows and don't charge anything, and obviously that's a big draw for people. But what happens when the cigarette companies find a more lucrative market somewhere, right? They can just leave the indie scene, and if you're over reliant on them, there will be no shows after they're gone. So I think that's what we don't want. You want to make sure the ecosystem of the independent scene is like in your own hands still. Like, yeah, sure, these companies can still come in every now and then, they can throw money at us, whatever, but you want to make sure they don't hold the key, essentially.
What's your how do you think about how a company like Maternal fits into that model, where they're a clothing label that's like sponsoring a lot of gigs, but they're more on the independent side of it?
Yeah, so I think what Maternal is doing is okay. So I remember when I was in high school, distro was a big thing, right? Distribution outlet. At the time, it was basically like little stores that sort of sell their own like clothing lines, but also sell like independent releases, right? So these distros were like the cool stores, because back then we didn't have anything like that. We didn't have Uniqlo or everything was like something that you buy at in big malls. So when distros came along, this was sort of the new fashion. This was the new language for younger kids. So I think Maternal is essentially an extension of that.
Right.
They are a distro. It's just they're so big, and they're essentially have taken over Bandung, if you will, and Do I have problem with them? No, not really. You know, they can do whatever they want. They sell clothes, but they definitely support the scene a lot. And without them, a lot of shows probably won't be organized or cannot be organized in Bandung. So, no problem with Maternal.
Yeah, I think they like a lot of their sponsorship, particularly like the shows I've seen in Bandung have mostly been on the metal kind of side of things.
Yep.
And the production quality is really amazing to actually see, like, I don't know, shows that would sound better than most venues that size in Australia actually. Like, it's, I don't know if we have anything like that in Australia on that kind of middle level.
Oh yeah. I think it's definitely like, I don't even know if we have something similar in like any like neighboring countries. You know, it's definitely like an Indonesian phenomenon. That we have something like Maternal, or even in Jakarta it'd be like something like Lawless, probably similar.
Yeah. Cool. So I know you have a split with Rec coming out.
Yes.
In the next couple months. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this was long overdue, basically.
Yeah.
Because I think aside from us, Rec is probably the only band also in Indonesia that plays sort of similar style. Revolution Summer, and the singer Acil is actually one of the very first people who reviewed Vague EP back in like 2010 or 11, and so that's how I got introduced to Acil. So we, and we've toured together with Reg, with Tarkam as well, and this was, we've been planning this for years, essentially.
Yeah.
But you know how DIY bands are.
Yeah.
We are slow. Nothing gets done on time.
Yeah.
But yeah, so like it's really exciting because I remember when Reg first came out, it was a bit unfair, but a lot of people sort of slapped the label. Oh, they are like Bandung's Vague, which is really unfair. And I know they were unhappy about it. So I think they've been writing a lot, trying to sort of find their own sound. And I think now we don't really sound. I mean, we still have a lot of similarities, but I think especially when Reg drops their full album, you can see they're going in a sort of darker, I don't want to say prog, but the last time I saw them live, I heard a bit of like Mars Volta sort of sound. So that's exciting. So yeah, I'm really excited that finally we're doing this with Reg, because really, when I came back here from Brisbane, there was really no emo scene, quote unquote. There were a lot of punks, a lot of hardcore, a lot of metal, a lot of grindcore, a lot of death metal, some shoegaze, some post rock. No post-hardcore or emo, strangely enough. So, yeah, I'm always excited when there's more bands sort of playing this style in the country.
So that's going to be out on Hema Records.
Hema Records
from Bali.
From I guess Bali now. Yeah.
Solo to Bali.
To Bali, yeah.
Do you know if there's any overseas distribution for that, or if it's just here?
So, on the we're gonna release the split on digital first, and I believe a 7-inch is coming out next year, 2020.
Yeah.
As far as overseas distribution, I don't know anything about that yet. If anyone's interested,
yeah. Any labels listening?
Yeah.
You have some other releases coming out next year. Are they ready to talk about, or still secret?
Sure. Nah. I don't do secrets. There's split with Jakarta band Barefoot early next year, and then obviously we have the split with Yo band as well. I don't know when it's gonna come out. I'm sorry, it's
ready.
taking us ages. But yeah, I think that one would be exciting just because at least we can get it release in at least 2 countries, right? Indonesia and Australia, and hopefully that means you guys can come back and do a proper tour this time.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
And maybe we can hit Australia as well. That has
Yeah.
been a long dream of mine,
Yeah, I would
because
love to see that happen.
because I feel like it would be like a full circle, because I started sort of my journey in Brisbane, and it would be funny to come back there to play.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll see some familiar, I'm sure I'll see some familiar faces at the shows, and that would be so much fun.
Yeah. Have you kept up very much with what's going on in Australia's scene since you came back here?
I mean, I think as much as I can anyway. I think the first like 3-4 years I was still very much in touch with like the Australian scene. I know what was going on and whatnot, and I still have some friends in Australia who are in bands, so I kind of know what they're doing and stuff. And you know, obviously I have you as well to tell me what's going on over there. But you know, I just know a few bands here and there, but I don't know what the actual communities are like, what sound is trending or huge or whatever. So that's the extent, I guess.
Yeah. Cool. Is there anything else you want to talk about or plug, or have you written anything recently you want to? Written anything for Vice that people could check out?
No, I haven't written any music content in a while.
Okay.
And hopefully that could change. What else? Oh, Vice is putting out. It's gonna be interesting. We're putting out a best of list, but this is not just end of year. This is best of decade.
Okay.
Indonesian music, like top 20 albums.
Oh, just for Indonesian music?
Top 20 albums,
Cool.
so like 2009 and 2019, top 20 songs.
Right.
And it's a big project, so it's not just our internal editorial team. We're actually paying other people, to sort of give us their lists, and we're gonna mix them all together.
So there's people from the scene here?
Correct.
Oh, cool.
Yeah,
That's gonna be a really good resource.
that
for-
hopefully represent like sort of different genres
Yeah,
and
yeah.
generation and yeah.
Cool.
This podcast probably will not gonna be out until next year.
Yeah, probably not. Yeah.
Alright, so then I can just say it.
Yeah.
One of the contributors is actually Sarana. I just
Yeah.
asked them today.
Cool.
Because I feel like they represent the younger generation. They represent noise. They represent female. And most importantly, they represent outside of Java.
Yeah.
So we want to try to get as much representation from like different, different facets of the scene.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's gonna be exciting.
Yeah.
I feel like it's gonna be a debate as well, because
Yeah.
once people give us their list and we have our list, there's going to be like a discussion, we call it, basically where you you justify with other people why this is number one,
Yeah,
why this
sure.
is number 5, why is this not in, why is that one in.
Yeah.
It's gonna be crazy.
So when's that coming out?
End of the year.
End of year.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So yeah, this will probably be out after that's released. So I'll make sure there's a link to that when we put it up.
Yeah.
Cool. Is there anything else we should talk about, or I think we've pretty much covered it?
I don't know, man. You tell me, because we talk about music all the time.
Yeah, I know. It's kind of strange interviewing someone that I've known for so long, and we hang out a lot too. So
Yeah. I mean, I suppose we didn't touch a lot on experimental music.
sure, yeah. I mean, what's going on in Jakarta for the experimental scene? Because I feel like I don't really have much of a grasp on it.
We have like, I don't know exactly what falls into experimental, but we have like, Logic Laws,
Sure.
like representing like electronic, Maverick, doing like hip hop electronic stuff, and then there's Hasana Records, who has been doing great stuff, and then there's from the older ones, Space Records, if you've heard them. Like a fine tuning creation. So there's all these bands, but they don't sort of, they're not. I would say they're not as united like Jogja Scene is.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Because Jogja Scene is very focused.
Yeah.
While Jakarta is just, there's like some experimental artists here going their way, experimental artists here going the other way.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, Blank Orb seems to be doing some interesting.
Hey?
Blank Orb Records.
Yeah.
seems to be doing some interesting
Yeah, yeah,
things
yeah,
as
yeah.
well.
Ual Masa as well, but
Right.
they're doing a lot of stuff overseas as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So.
but it's small here. You think?
Hey,
Do you think it's quite a small scene here in Jakarta?
I mean, small in terms of because there's a lot of other scenes, and experimental has never been the focus here, like it is in Jogja. You know what I mean? Like you can see it when Senyawa play their like solo show in Jakarta. I think they didn't even get like 300 people. You know what I mean? And so I think there's interest, but it's in very small pockets, and so the noising sort of have to merge, if not become a part of other sort of bigger scene, because there's just not enough of it to sustain it here. You know, I think noise artists, they do like their own shows every now and then, but you know, those shows are not big or anything.
I talked to the guys from Bottle Smoker a couple of days ago,
Yep.
and we were talking a bit about how I guess that band and Senyawa and now Gabber
Yep.
and some other bands is kind of maybe reignited a bit of interest in young people here for more traditional forms of Indonesian music.
Yeah.
Do you think that's kind of, there's some interest in that in Jakarta too?
I mean, okay, so there's the interesting thing about that is that I think there's a very thin line between having a genuine interest in like traditional music and like just sort of exploiting it
Sure.
for a bit of an edge. But this is also an argument I don't really want to get into because it's very tricky. But yeah, I feel like there should be more interest in traditional music. I feel like the thoughts that go into a lot of people is that traditional music is something that you cannot sell. You cannot make money from it, and it's not really hip, quote unquote, or cool to play it. But you know, if you've taken a look, and a lot of bands, even bands overseas, a lot of them like have used gamelan or any other, you know, traditional instruments, and they manage to sort of incorporate it into their sound. So I feel like there's really no reason that we can't do that here. So hopefully, you know, if this new wave of like noise experimental whatever bands can reignite that, I feel like that would be amazing. I would love to hear shoegaze band with fucking gamelan.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That'd be amazing.
Yeah, I can see that working too.
Yeah, absolutely, right? It's
Yeah.
just wall of noise, and
Yeah,
then,
yeah.
hey, I would want to know like what gamelan sounds like going through a fuzz pedal. See?
yeah.
That'd be amazing.
I have seen people in Jogja do that
Hell
for
yeah.
noise gigs.
Hell yeah.
But like even I was talking to Will Guthrie a few weeks ago
Yep.
and asking him about his interest in traditional music
Mm-hmm.
in Indonesia, and he was kind of saying like he hears a lot of similarities between something like Sano and
Yep.
and gamelan, like
Yeah.
just the way the frequencies interact or something.
It's textures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of possibility there.
Yeah, and I think it's also like, I don't want to say it's homework, but that's, you know, there's a lot of, I feel like, spaces in music that have not been tapped, especially by a lot of artists maybe in Jakarta, because we have an industry going, and it would be so much easier to just be a pop band or a rock band and, you know, get into big festivals and play for money, as opposed to going a more difficult route. But yeah, but there are people here and there that sort of try to keep that alive.
Cool. Well, I think we can probably wrap it up there if there's
Sure.
nothing else. Thanks so much for doing this.
No problem, man.
to this episode of Porous Borders. If you're interested in exploring more underground music from the Asia-Pacific region, you can check out my YouTube channel, Concrescence Records. You can find the link to that in the show notes. If you like the podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review in the iTunes store. If you have suggestions or feedback and you want to get in touch, you can email the show at porousborders@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram at @ANDRWMH.